In the bustling city of Charlotte, North Carolina, retired Army Colonel Grace Taylor had hoped for a quiet life after years of service. But a chance encounter at a local supermarket ignited a chain of events she could never have anticipated. When she confronted a dismissive police officer over a small act of irresponsibility, Grace's calm yet resolute stand captured the attention of her community and sparked a debate that would ripple far beyond the aisles of that store. What began as a simple call for accountability grew into something much larger, a movement to rebuild trust, foster leadership, and inspire unity in a divided world. Along the way, Grace encountered resistance and doubt, but also discovered allies in unexpected places, people who shared her vision of a community built on integrity and respect. As Grace's efforts expanded, so did the stakes. Could she and her growing team of allies overcome the obstacles in their path? Would their initiatives make a lasting impact, or would skepticism and resistance derail their progress? On a breezy Saturday afternoon in Charlotte, North Carolina, Colonel Grace Taylor walked through the aisles of a small neighborhood supermarket. The soft hum of fluorescent lights and the faint murmur of shoppers created a calm that Grace cherished. Wearing a plain white shirt, blue jeans, and sneakers, she blended seamlessly into the crowd. Her unassuming appearance gave no hint of her years, commanding troops on distant battlefields, or the resilience forged in the crucible of military service. Grace had retired from the Army a year earlier, trading the structured chaos of deployment for a quieter life. Her modest two-bedroom home, tucked away on a tree-lined street, was her sanctuary. She spent her days tending to a small garden, volunteering at local charities, and catching up on books that had gathered dust during her service. The supermarket trips were part of this new, slower rhythm, a way of savoring the ordinary moments she had once taken for granted. As she reached for a jar of peanut butter, a loud crash shattered the tranquility. Grace turned, her sharp instincts honed by years of discipline kicking in. At the end of the aisle, a tall man in a police uniform, Officer Brian Carter, stood next to an overturned display of cereal boxes and a spilled gallon of milk. For a moment, Grace expected Brian to kneel down, pick up the mess, and apologize. Instead, he shrugged, his expression indifferent, and walked away, leaving the aisle in disarray. Grace frowned, her mind racing. The uniform he wore symbolized service, responsibility, and accountability, yet his actions conveyed none of those values. Without hesitation, Grace pushed her cart aside and approached him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It seems you dropped something back there." Brian glanced at her, barely masking his irritation. "Not my problem," he muttered and continued walking. The casual dismissal stung. Grace had spent her career upholding the principles of integrity and accountability, often under the harshest conditions. She could not stand by and let this go unanswered. "Officer Carter," she called out, her tone resolute. He stopped and turned, his face a mix of annoyance and incredulity. "What do you want?" Grace took a step closer, meeting his gaze steadily. "You are wearing a uniform that commands respect, but respect is earned by actions. Leaving that mess for someone else to clean up undermines the trust people place in you." Brian scoffed, crossing his arms. "And who are you to tell me what to do? Some civilian with too much time on their hands?" The condescension in his voice made her bristle, but she maintained her composure. "I am Grace Taylor, a retired colonel of the United States Army, and as a citizen of this community, I have every right to hold you accountable." A few shoppers nearby slowed their steps, their curious gazes flicking between Grace and Brian. The tension in the air was palpable, but Grace stood her ground, her years of leadership lending her a quiet authority. Brian's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Well, Colonel," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "maybe you should focus on your retirement and let me do my job." Grace felt a surge of anger, but refused to let it show. Your job is to serve and protect. If you cannot even take responsibility for something as small as this, how can people trust you with larger matters? Her words seemed to strike a chord, and Brian's smirk disappeared entirely. Still, he said nothing, turning on his heel and walking away toward the checkout counter. Grace stayed behind, cleaning up the spilled milk and cereal herself. Several shoppers approached, offering to help. A woman in her 30s handed Grace a stack of paper towels. "Thank you for speaking up," the woman said. "I saw what happened, and I wanted to say that it means a lot to see someone stand up for what is right." Grace gave a small smile. "It is something we all have a responsibility to do." The woman nodded and returned to her shopping, leaving Grace to finish tidying up. As Grace exited the store, bags of groceries in hand, she felt a mix of emotions: frustration at Brian's dismissiveness, pride in having spoken up, and a lingering sense of disquiet. It was a small incident, but it hinted at a larger issue: a lack of accountability among those entrusted with power. Driving home, Grace replayed the encounter in her mind. She thought about the shoppers who had gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. She thought about the woman who had thanked her, and the way Brian's initial arrogance had faltered under the weight of her words. By the time she pulled into her driveway, Grace had made a decision. She would not let the incident end there. Her life had been defined by standing up for what was right, even in the face of adversity. This was no different. As she unpacked her groceries and prepared a simple dinner, Grace jotted down notes in her journal, a habit she had maintained throughout her career. Her thoughts spilled onto the page, a mix of frustration, determination, and hope. "I cannot change the world," she wrote, "but perhaps I can help change one corner of it." Grace resolved to reach out to her network of fellow veterans, community leaders, and friends. Perhaps together, they could address the underlying issues of accountability and integrity, not just in law enforcement, but in all areas of public service. That night, as Grace sat in her living room, sipping tea and listening to the soft hum of her ceiling fan, she felt a sense of purpose stirring within her. The road ahead would not be easy, but Grace Taylor had never been one to back down from a challenge. Little did she know, her actions that day would set off a chain of events that would ripple far beyond a small supermarket aisle, touching lives and sparking a movement for change. And so, with quiet determination, Grace began the next chapter of her journey, a story of resilience, kindness, and the unwavering belief in the power of doing what is right. The following morning, Grace Taylor woke early, her thoughts still lingering on the encounter with Officer Brian Carter. She had replayed the scene in her mind several times, questioning whether she had done enough or too much. Yet, the more she reflected, the more she felt her actions were justified. She had spent her life advocating for accountability, and this was no time to stop. After breakfast, Grace decided to take a walk through her neighborhood to clear her head. The crisp air carried the faint scent of blooming magnolias, and the quiet streets offered a soothing backdrop for her thoughts. But even the peaceful surroundings could not quell the growing unease she felt about the incident. By the time she returned home, Grace had made up her mind. She would not let the matter rest. She would visit the local precinct to file a formal complaint, not out of spite, but because she believed accountability was essential for trust, especially for those in uniform. Later that day, Grace arrived at the Charlotte Police Department, her posture straight and purposeful. The lobby was bustling, with officers and civilians moving briskly. A young receptionist greeted her with a polite smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I help you?" Grace introduced herself and explained the purpose of her visit. "I would like to speak to someone about an incident involving Officer Brian Carter." The receptionist's expression shifted slightly, her professional demeanor masking any personal thoughts. "Of course. Please have a seat, and I will see who is available." Minutes later, a middle-aged officer with kind eyes and a calm demeanor approached. Colonel Taylor, I am Sergeant James Howard. I understand you have a concern about one of our officers? Grace stood and extended her hand. Thank you for meeting with me, Sergeant. Yes, I witnessed an incident yesterday involving Officer Carter that I believe warrants attention. In a small conference room, Grace recounted the supermarket encounter, her tone even but firm. She described Brian's dismissive attitude and refusal to take responsibility, emphasizing the importance of integrity in positions of authority. Sergeant Howard listened attentively, nodding occasionally. When Grace finished, he folded his hands on the table. Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Colonel Taylor. We take these matters seriously. I will ensure the incident is reviewed thoroughly. Grace appreciated his professionalism, but sensed a hesitation in his words. I hope this is not just a formality, she said, her voice steady. Accountability is not optional, especially for those entrusted with public trust. Howard met her gaze, his tone measured. You are absolutely right. We will address it appropriately. As Grace left the precinct, she felt a mix of satisfaction and uncertainty. Filing the complaint was the right thing to do, but she knew it was only the first step in addressing a deeper issue. That evening, Grace called an old friend, Captain Susan Miller, who had served alongside her in the Army. Susan, now retired as well, had dedicated her post-military life to community outreach programs. After catching up briefly, Grace shared the details of the supermarket encounter. I cannot shake the feeling that this is part of a larger problem, she said. If someone in uniform can act so dismissively in public, what does that say about the culture within the department? Susan was quiet for a moment before replying. You are asking the right questions, Grace. The question is, what are you going to do about it? The words struck a chord. Grace had always believed in action, in stepping up when something needed to be done. I do not know yet, she admitted, but I will figure it out. The next morning, Grace found herself drawn to her journal again, writing out her thoughts and ideas. As her pen moved across the page, a plan began to take shape. She would leverage her experience as a leader and her connections within the community to foster conversations about accountability, respect, and the responsibilities of public servants. Her first step was to reach out to local organizations and veteran groups, inviting them to collaborate on a series of workshops and discussions. She envisioned bringing together people from all walks of life: law enforcement, teachers, community leaders, and everyday citizens to explore how they could build trust and lead by example. Meanwhile, at the Charlotte Police Department, the complaint against Officer Carter had reached the attention of his superiors. Brian was called into a meeting with his commanding officer, Lieutenant Karen Evans. Officer Carter, Lieutenant Evans began, her tone firm, we have received a formal complaint regarding your conduct at a local supermarket. Witnesses reported that you refused to take responsibility for a mess you created and dismissed a civilian's concerns in a disrespectful manner. Brian bristled. With all due respect, Lieutenant, it was a small incident. People are blowing it out of proportion. Evans raised an eyebrow. Small or not, your behavior reflects on this department. The person who filed the complaint is Colonel Grace Taylor, a retired officer of the United States Army. Her account, along with witness statements, paints a picture of behavior that is unacceptable for someone in uniform. Brian's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. You are being placed under review, Evans continued. I suggest you use this time to reflect on what it means to wear that badge. Unaware of the internal discussions at the precinct, Grace focused on her efforts to create change. Within days, she had arranged a meeting with leaders from local nonprofits and veteran groups, sharing her vision for a series of community workshops. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People were eager to engage, recognizing the need for conversations about integrity and respect. The first event was scheduled for the following month, and Grace felt a renewed sense of purpose as she dove into planning. One evening, as she finalized details for the workshop, Grace received a message from Sergeant Howard. The internal review of Officer Carter was underway, and he wanted to keep her informed of the progress. "Thank you for standing up," he wrote. "Your actions have sparked important discussions here at the precinct." Grace set the phone down, her resolve strengthening. She had always believed that change started with a single step, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew she was walking in the right direction. The clash with Brian Carter had been an unwelcome disruption, but it had also ignited a fire within her, a determination to ensure that accountability and respect were not just words, but principles upheld in every corner of her community. The days following Grace Taylor's complaint against Officer Brian Carter were marked by a mix of anticipation and tension. While Grace focused on organizing the first community workshop, she could not ignore the murmurs spreading throughout Charlotte. The story of her supermarket confrontation had gained traction. Bolstered by cell phone footage that surfaced online, the video showed Grace calmly holding Officer Carter accountable, her composed demeanor contrasting sharply with his dismissive attitude. The clip sparked widespread discussion, drawing a flood of support for Grace's stance while also igniting heated debates about respect, authority, and accountability. Grace, who had always been a private person, found herself thrust into the public eye in ways she had not anticipated. One morning, Grace sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through comments on a social media post about the incident. Most were supportive, praising her courage and principles, but a few were harshly critical. "Why does she think she's better than a cop?" One comment read, "Leave the guy alone. Everyone makes mistakes." Grace sighed, setting her phone down. The negative comments stung, but they did not deter her. She had always believed in standing firm for what was right, even when faced with opposition. Still, the spotlight was uncomfortable. Her thoughts were interrupted by a call from Captain Susan Miller. "Grace, I just saw the video," Susan said, her voice warm with encouragement. "You handled yourself beautifully. How are you holding up?" "I am fine," Grace replied, though the weariness in her voice betrayed her. "I just did what I thought was right. I never expected it to become this." Susan chuckled. "You stirred the pot, Grace. And sometimes that is exactly what needs to happen. Just remember, you are not alone in this." The reassurance bolstered Grace's spirits. "Thank you, Susan. That means a lot." Meanwhile, at the Charlotte Police Department, the growing attention on Officer Carter placed the department under scrutiny. The precinct buzzed with whispered conversations about the incident, with some officers defending Brian and others quietly questioning his behavior. Brian, for his part, grew increasingly defensive. Sitting at his desk, he stared at the screen of his phone, where the video of the supermarket incident played on a loop. The comments, some critical, others mocking, stoked his frustration. "What does she know about being a cop?" he muttered under his breath. Lieutenant Karen Evans approached his desk, her expression unreadable. "Carter, a word in my office." Inside, Evans closed the door and motioned for Brian to sit. "I am going to be blunt," she began. "The public outcry over this incident has put our department in a difficult position. This is not just about you anymore. It is about how people perceive us as a whole." Brian crossed his arms, his tone defensive. "With all due respect, Lieutenant, this is being blown out of proportion. It was a minor incident." Evans leaned forward, her voice firm but not unkind. "Perception matters, Carter. And right now, the perception is that you are not living up to the standards this uniform demands. If you cannot see that, then we have a bigger problem than I thought." Her words left Brian silent, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. As the tension at the precinct simmered, Grace threw herself into preparing for the upcoming workshop. Held at the local community center, the event would bring together residents, police officers, teachers, and civic leaders to discuss values like integrity, accountability, and mutual respect. The night before the event, Grace sat at her desk, reviewing her notes. She wanted to strike the right balance, addressing the issues at hand without alienating anyone. Her goal was not to divide, but to foster understanding and encourage change. The morning of the workshop dawned crisp and clear. Grace arrived early to help set up, arranging chairs in a circle and placing printed agendas on each seat. She was joined by a small team of volunteers, including Captain Susan Miller and Clara, a young teacher Grace had recently befriended through her outreach efforts. As attendees trickled in, Grace felt a mix of nerves and excitement. Among the crowd, she noticed Sergeant James Howard, who had taken her complaint about Brian Carter seriously. He gave her a nod of encouragement as he found a seat. When the room filled, Grace stepped to the center, her voice steady as she welcomed everyone. "Thank you for being here today," she began. "This workshop is not about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It is about coming together as a community to discuss how we can build trust, lead with integrity, and create a culture of accountability." The discussions that followed were candid and, at times, emotional. Residents shared stories of positive interactions with police officers, as well as moments when trust had been broken. Officers spoke about the challenges of their jobs and the toll it took on their morale. Teachers discussed the importance of leading by example, both in the classroom and beyond. At one point, a young officer named Maria Hayes raised her hand. "I want to thank Colonel Taylor for organizing this," she said. "It is not easy to wear this uniform every day, knowing the expectations people have of us. But I also know that we have to meet those expectations. That is the only way to earn trust." Her words resonated deeply, and Grace felt a surge of hope. By the time the workshop ended, the mood in the room had shifted. What began as a tense gathering had transformed into a space of mutual understanding and shared purpose. People lingered afterward, exchanging contact information and brainstorming ways to continue the dialogue. As Grace packed up her materials, Sergeant Howard approached her. "This was a powerful start," he said. "You have a way of bringing people together, Colonel. I hope you know that." Grace smiled, her earlier nerves replaced by quiet pride. "Thank you, Sergeant. I just want to help where I can." That evening, as Grace returned home, she felt a sense of fulfillment she had not experienced in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, but the workshop had shown her that progress was possible. As she settled into her chair with her journal, Grace jotted down her reflections. "Change is not about grand gestures," she wrote. "It is about the small steps we take every day to make things better for ourselves and for others." Closing the journal, Grace looked out at the night sky, the stars twinkling faintly above. The storm of attention and debate surrounding the supermarket incident had grown larger than she ever imagined, but it had also sparked conversations that needed to happen. And as Grace prepared for the challenges yet to come, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than a clash of principles. It was the beginning of something much greater. In the days following the workshop, Grace Taylor found herself overwhelmed by the community's response. Messages poured in emails, handwritten letters, and even a few phone calls from people inspired by the open discussions. Some shared their own experiences of injustice or accountability. Others simply expressed gratitude for the opportunity to be heard. One morning, as Grace sat at her kitchen table, sifting through the latest batch of messages, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Captain Susan Miller. "Have you checked the local news? You might want to." Curious, Grace turned on the television. A segment about the workshop was airing, highlighting its success and featuring interviews with attendees. The coverage painted a picture of hope and resilience, emphasizing the importance of trust and accountability in the community. Grace's name was mentioned several times, always accompanied by praise for her leadership. While the recognition felt undeserved, she saw herself as simply doing what was right. It also confirmed that her efforts were making an impact. Meanwhile, at the Charlotte Police Department, the tension surrounding Officer Brian Carter had reached a boiling point. The precinct was abuzz with conversations about the workshop, the viral video, and Grace's ongoing efforts. For many officers, the incident had sparked serious reflection. Brian, however, remained defiant. Sitting in the break room, he scrolled through his phone, his jaw tightening as he read comments on yet another article about the supermarket encounter. "This whole thing is ridiculous," he muttered, tossing his phone onto the table. Maria Hayes, the young officer who had spoken at the workshop, sat across from him. "Maybe," she said carefully, "but it is making people talk about things we usually avoid." Brian scoffed. "Easy for you to say. You are not the one being dragged through the mud." Maria hesitated before replying. "It is not just about you, Brian. It is about all of us, and how we can do better. Maybe it is time to think about why people are upset instead of just being defensive." Her words struck a nerve, but Brian said nothing, retreating to his desk with a scowl. That afternoon, Grace received an unexpected email from Sergeant James Howard. He thanked her for the workshop and updated her on the department's internal review of Officer Carter. "We are addressing the incident," the email read, "but the workshop has sparked something greater here. Officers are engaging in discussions we have not had before. Change is slow, but it is starting. I thought you should know." Grace reread the message twice, her heart lifting. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. Determined to build on this momentum, Grace began planning the next workshop, this time focusing on collaborative problem-solving. She envisioned scenarios where residents and officers worked together to address common challenges, from public safety to youth engagement. One evening, as she finalized details for the event, her doorbell rang. Grace opened it to find Clara, the young teacher who had become one of her most passionate supporters, standing on the porch with a folder in hand. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," Clara said, "but I wanted to share something with you." Inviting her in, Grace listened as Clara explained. "After the first workshop, I started thinking about how we could bring these lessons into schools. So I put together a proposal for a leadership program for students. I was hoping you might take a look." Grace flipped through the folder, her admiration for Clara growing with each page. The program was thoughtful and well organized, with activities designed to teach accountability, empathy, and teamwork. "This is wonderful, Clara," Grace said sincerely. "You are onto something here. I would be honored to help you make it happen." Clara's face lit up. "Thank you, Grace. I could not have done this without your inspiration." The second workshop drew an even larger crowd than the first. Held in the library's event space, it featured breakout groups tackling hypothetical scenarios designed to encourage collaboration and understanding. Grace moved from group to group, listening as residents and officers worked side by side, their discussions candid and respectful. At one table, Maria Hayes shared her perspective as a young officer trying to balance the expectations of the job with her personal values. Across from her, a middle-aged man named Robert, who had been vocal about his distrust of law enforcement, nodded thoughtfully. "I never thought about it that way," Robert admitted. "You have a tough job, and I respect that. I just wish more officers handled things like you do." Maria smiled, her tone humble. "I am trying, but it is not easy. Conversations like this help, though." Grace watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Moments like this were the reason she had taken on this challenge. As the evening ended, Grace stood at the front of the room to thank the attendees. "Tonight, we took another step forward," she said. "The road to trust and accountability is long, but every conversation, every small action, brings us closer." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, a reflection of the hope filling the room. That night, as Grace returned home, she felt a sense of fulfillment she could not put into words. The workshops were creating ripples of change, reaching corners of the community she had never imagined. But she also knew there was more work to be done. The challenges of building trust and fostering accountability were far from over. Still, Grace was ready to face them, buoyed by the knowledge that she was not alone in this journey. In her journal, she wrote, "Sometimes, all it takes is one spark to ignite a movement. Together, we can keep the fire burning." As she set her pen down and gazed out at the night sky, Grace felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was no longer just about a single incident. It was about the enduring power of resilience, kindness, and the belief that change was always possible. The aftermath of the second workshop brought with it an air of cautious optimism. Grace Taylor found herself busier than ever, juggling new initiatives sparked by the discussions while also maintaining the connections she had fostered within the community. But amid the growing momentum, she felt a persistent undercurrent of reflection on her actions, the path ahead, and the deep-seated challenges still looming. One morning, as Grace prepared a pot of coffee, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Maria Hayes, the young officer whose sincerity and thoughtfulness had stood out during the workshops. "Hi, Colonel Taylor. I wanted to thank you again for the workshop. It has helped me see my role differently, and I am trying to encourage some of my colleagues to join the next one. Let me know how I can help." Grace smiled at the message, replying with a heartfelt thank you. Maria's willingness to engage reminded her that change often began with individuals willing to look inward and take small steps forward. Meanwhile, at the Charlotte Police Department, Officer Brian Carter found himself at a crossroads. His suspension had left him with plenty of time to think a situation he had initially resented, but now saw as unavoidable. Sitting in his modest apartment one evening, Brian sifted through the reports and paperwork related to his disciplinary hearing. Alongside them sat a collection of letters and emails from colleagues, some supportive, others critical. He had also re-watched the viral video more times than he cared to admit. Each viewing forced him to confront the image of himself, dismissing Grace Taylor with disdain. The man in the video seemed unrecognizable, arrogant, dismissive, and far removed from the values he had once believed defined him. Frustration bubbled within him, but so did something deeper, an uncomfortable sense of accountability. Grace was unaware of Brian's internal struggle as she continued her work. One afternoon, she met with Clara at a local coffee shop to discuss the leadership program for students. Clara had made significant progress, and her excitement was contagious. "We have approval from the school board to pilot the program at 3 middle schools," Clara said, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. "I could not have done this without your help, Grace." Grace shook her head, her smile warm. "You did the work, Clara. I am just glad I could support you." As they went over the program details, Grace felt a deep sense of pride. Clara's initiative was a testament to what could happen when people found the courage to lead, no matter the scale. That evening, Grace returned home to find an unexpected letter in her mailbox. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, and as she opened it, her curiosity grew. The letter was from Brian Carter. The words were hesitant but sincere, expressing a mix of regret and reflection. "Colonel Taylor, I am writing to apologize for my actions during the incident at the supermarket. Watching the video and hearing about the workshops you have led have made me realize how much I need to change, not just as an officer, but as a person. I have started attending counseling and leadership training sessions, and I am working to be better. I wanted to thank you for holding me accountable. Without that, I might not have taken this step." Brian's words left Grace sitting in stunned silence. She reread the letter, her emotions swirling. It was rare for someone to admit fault so openly, let alone seek to grow from their mistakes. She set the letter aside, her mind turning to the next steps. Grace knew this was a moment to encourage further growth, not just for Brian, but for the broader community. Over the next few days, Grace worked on her response. She carefully chose her words, aiming to strike a balance between support and expectation. "Dear Officer Carter, thank you for your letter and for taking the difficult but necessary step of reflecting on your actions. Growth is never easy, but it is the foundation of leadership and integrity. I encourage you to continue your efforts, not only for yourself, but for the community you serve. If you ever wish to share your experiences with others, you might find that your story can inspire others to reflect and grow as well. Grace mailed the letter with a sense of closure, hoping it would serve as a stepping stone for Brian's continued journey. Meanwhile, the ripples of Grace's workshops continued to spread. Community members who had attended began organizing smaller initiatives, book clubs focused on leadership, neighborhood safety programs, and even an art project celebrating unity. One afternoon, as Grace visited the library to drop off materials for the next workshop, she noticed a mural taking shape on the wall outside. A group of students and volunteers worked together, painting a vibrant scene depicting hands of different colors joining to form a circle. Maria Hayes stood nearby, helping a young boy mix paint. She waved to Grace, who approached with curiosity. "What is this?" Grace asked, her tone warm. "The students wanted to create something to represent the community coming together," Maria explained. "It is their way of showing how much the workshops have inspired them." Grace felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched the mural take shape. The bright colors and collaborative energy reminded her why she had embarked on this journey in the first place. That evening, Grace reflected on the unfolding changes around her. The seeds she had planted both through her actions and her words were beginning to bear fruit. People were engaging, reflecting, and finding ways to contribute. But she also knew there was still work to be done. Trust and accountability were not built overnight, and setbacks were inevitable. Yet, Grace felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing that each small step forward was a victory worth celebrating. As she wrote in her journal that night, her thoughts were filled with hope. Change begins within us, but it is sustained by the connections we build. Together, we can create a foundation that endures. Setting her pen down, Grace looked out at the quiet street beyond her window. The road ahead was long, but it was one she was proud to walk hand in hand with a community determined to rise above its challenges and build something lasting. The momentum sparked by Grace Taylor's workshops continued to grow, bringing a renewed sense of purpose to the community. Yet, with progress came challenges, as Grace began to realize that sustaining this movement required not just effort, but collaboration on an even larger scale. One morning, Grace met with Captain Susan Miller at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. The two women had become frequent collaborators, and their discussions often spurred new ideas. "Susan," Grace began, stirring her tea thoughtfully, "the workshops are making an impact, but I feel like we're only addressing the surface. To truly change the culture of accountability, we need to go deeper into schools, workplaces, and even family conversations." Susan nodded, her expression serious. "You're right. Change has to be systemic, not just situational. Have you considered partnering with civic leaders? The more buy-in we have, the more lasting the impact." Grace leaned back, her mind racing. "I've thought about it, but I wasn't sure how to approach it. These initiatives have been grassroots, and I don't want them to lose that authenticity." "They won't," Susan reassured her. "If anything, a broader network could amplify your message. Let's start by meeting with the mayor's office and see where it takes us." Over the next week, Grace and Susan worked to arrange a meeting with Mayor Evelyn Brooks, a forward-thinking leader known for her dedication to civic engagement. Grace felt a mix of excitement and nerves as the meeting approached, knowing it was a pivotal step for their movement. When the day arrived, Grace entered the mayor's office with Susan by her side. The room was warm and inviting, lined with bookshelves and local artwork. Mayor Brooks greeted them with a firm handshake and a genuine smile. "I've heard a lot about your workshops, Colonel Taylor," the mayor began. "The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. I'm glad we have the chance to talk." "Thank you, Mayor Brooks," Grace replied. The workshops have been a start, but there's so much more to do. My hope is to collaborate with city leaders to create programs that address accountability and respect at every level. The mayor listened intently as Grace outlined her vision, nodding thoughtfully. I think you're onto something, Colonel. Let's explore how we can integrate these ideas into existing city programs. With your leadership and our resources, I believe we can create something transformative. The partnership with the mayor's office brought new opportunities and challenges. Grace found herself attending planning meetings, consulting with educators and civic leaders, and even speaking at city events. The work was demanding, but she was buoyed by the community's enthusiasm. One evening, as Grace reviewed her notes for an upcoming presentation, she received a call from Maria Hayes. "Colonel Taylor," Maria began, her voice filled with excitement, "I've been talking to some of my colleagues, and we'd like to start a mentorship program within the department. Officers mentoring officers focused on leadership, accountability, and community engagement. I wanted to get your input." Grace smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Maria, that's an incredible idea. I'd be happy to help you develop it. Initiatives like this can create a ripple effect that extends far beyond the department." "Thank you," Maria said, her tone sincere. "Your workshops inspired this. We're ready to take action." As Grace worked with Maria to shape the mentorship program, she noticed a shift in the conversations around her. Officers who had once been skeptical began to engage, sharing their own stories and exploring ways to improve their interactions with the community. Even Officer Brian Carter, who had been at the center of the initial controversy, reached out to Grace. His letter of apology had been followed by months of counseling and training, and now he wanted to participate in the mentorship program. "I want to contribute," Brian said during a phone call with Grace. "I made mistakes, but I've learned from them. If my story can help someone else avoid the same path, it's worth sharing." Grace was cautious but supportive. "That's a commendable goal, Brian. Growth comes from acknowledging our missteps and using them to build something better. Let's work together to make this program impactful." The mentorship program launched a month later with a small but dedicated group of officers. Grace attended the inaugural session, watching as Maria and Brian led discussions about leadership and accountability. During a break, Brian approached Grace, his demeanor markedly different from the man she had encountered at the supermarket. "Colonel Taylor," he began, his tone earnest, "I want to thank you for not giving up on accountability, even when it was hard to hear. You've helped me see the bigger picture." Grace regarded him thoughtfully. "Thank you, Brian. Change isn't easy, but it's worth it. I hope you continue to lead by example." As the weeks turned into months, the initiatives Grace had championed began to weave themselves into the fabric of the community. The mentorship program gained traction, the student leadership initiative expanded to more schools, and the workshops evolved into citywide events attended by hundreds. One afternoon, as Grace walked through the park near her home, she noticed a group of children playing near a newly installed mural. The artwork, which had been painted during one of the community events, depicted hands of different colors forming a circle, surrounded by words like respect, trust, and hope. A young boy approached her, pointing at the mural. "Did you help make this?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Grace knelt to his level, smiling. "I helped bring people together, but everyone contributed. It's a symbol of what we can do when we work as a team." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "It's really cool. I want to do stuff like this when I grow up." Grace's heart swelled at his words. "You can, and you will," she said warmly. That evening, Grace sat at her desk, reflecting on how far they had come. The road had been filled with challenges, but every step had been worth it. She opened her journal and wrote, "When people come together with a shared purpose, change becomes inevitable. The key is to keep moving forward, even when the path seems uncertain." As she closed the journal and looked out at the quiet street, Grace felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The movement she had started was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the entire community. With resilience, kindness, and hope as their foundation, they were building something that would endure for generations to come. The brisk autumn air carried the faint scent of turning leaves as Grace Taylor arrived at the library for a planning meeting. It was the heart of their movement, a place where ideas were born and actions took shape. The walls, once quiet and unassuming, now buzzed with energy, adorned with posters promoting workshops, mentorship programs, and student leadership initiatives. Inside, Grace found Clara setting up chairs around a large table. Maria Hayes and Captain Susan Miller were already seated, reviewing a list of upcoming events. The group had grown into a team, each member bringing unique strengths to the table. "Good morning, everyone," Grace greeted as she took her seat. "We've got a lot to cover today, so let's dive in." Susan nodded, sliding a folder toward Grace. "The mentorship program is exceeding expectations. Officers are engaging, and we've had several requests from other precincts to replicate it. Maria and Brian have done a phenomenal job leading the charge." Grace glanced at Maria, who looked both proud and slightly overwhelmed. "That's incredible news," Grace said. "Maria, your leadership is setting an example for so many. How do you feel about expanding the program?" Maria hesitated, then smiled. "It's exciting but daunting. I'll need help to scale it up, but I'm willing to try." "We're here to support you," Grace assured her. As the meeting progressed, Clara presented updates on the Student Leadership Initiative, now active in 6 schools across the city. The program had drawn praise from teachers and parents alike, with students showing measurable improvements in confidence and empathy. "We're planning a showcase event next month," Clara explained, "where students can share what they've learned through projects and presentations. I'd love for you to attend, Grace." Grace nodded, her admiration for Clara evident. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The meeting ended with plans for a large community gathering, an opportunity to celebrate their progress while addressing lingering challenges. As the group dispersed, Grace stayed behind, tidying the space and reflecting on the road that had brought them here. Maria lingered, her brow furrowed in thought. "Colonel Taylor," she began, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," Grace replied, setting down a stack of papers. "How do you stay so calm and focused, even when things get hard?" Maria's voice carried a hint of vulnerability. Grace smiled gently. "Years of practice, and a lot of mistakes along the way. But mostly, I remind myself why I started. Every step we take might feel small, but together, they add up to something meaningful. And when the weight feels heavy, lean on your team. That's what we're here for." Maria nodded, her shoulders relaxing. "Thank you. I needed to hear that." In the weeks leading up to the community gathering, the energy across Charlotte was palpable. Flyers appeared in shop windows, local radio stations mentioned the event, and people buzzed with anticipation. Grace felt a mix of excitement and pressure, knowing the event was as much about celebrating progress as it was about galvanizing action. The day arrived under a clear blue sky. The city park was transformed into a vibrant hub of activity, with tents housing interactive exhibits, food stalls, and a stage for speakers and performers. Grace stood near the entrance, greeting attendees as they streamed in. She spotted familiar faces, teachers, students, officers, and residents who had become regulars at the workshops and new ones, drawn by curiosity or a desire to connect. Maria and Brian led a booth showcasing the mentorship program, while Clara worked with students to present their leadership projects. Susan managed logistics, ensuring everything ran smoothly. As the crowd settled for the main program, Grace stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding. She took a moment to look out at the sea of faces, the collective energy filling her with both gratitude and determination. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady. "Thank you for being here today. This gathering is a testament to what we can achieve when we come together with a shared purpose. In the past few months, we've started important conversations about accountability, respect, and leadership. We've launched programs that are already making a difference, and we've built connections that strengthen our community. But our work is far from done. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. It takes persistence, courage, and most importantly, unity. Each of you here today is part of this journey, and I am so proud of what we've accomplished together. The crowd erupted into applause, and Grace stepped back, allowing other speakers to share their perspectives. The event was a resounding success, filled with moments that reaffirmed Grace's belief in the power of community. A young boy shyly approached her, holding a drawing he had made of the mural outside the library. "This is for you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace knelt to accept the drawing, her heart swelling. "Thank you. This means so much to me." Nearby, Maria introduced Brian to a group of young officers interested in the mentorship program. Clara beamed as students shared their projects, their confidence shining brightly. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a golden glow, Grace stood with Susan, watching the crowd begin to disperse. "You've built something remarkable here," Susan said. "We've built it," Grace corrected, her voice firm but kind. "This is all of us." Susan smiled. "Still, none of it would have happened without your leadership." Grace gazed at the scene before her, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. It's not about one person, it's about the ripples we create, the lives we touch, and the future we build together. That night, as Grace wrote in her journal, she reflected on the day's events and the road ahead. The seeds we plant today will grow into something greater than we can imagine. And together, we'll tend to this garden of change, ensuring it thrives for generations to come. With that thought, she closed her journal, feeling a quiet peace. The journey was far from over, but Grace knew she was exactly where she was meant to be, leading, inspiring, and building a community united by hope and determination. The morning after the community gathering, Grace Taylor sat in her kitchen, the lingering warmth of the event still filling her thoughts. Sunlight streamed through the window, dappling the table where she had spread out notes, thank you letters, and plans for upcoming initiatives. Oliver, her faithful cat, napped lazily nearby, his tail flicking occasionally as if in approval of her progress. Grace had always believed in the ripple effect of small actions, but seeing it unfold so vividly at the gathering had reaffirmed her faith in the power of unity. The event had been more than a celebration. It was a reminder of how far they had come, and how much further they could go together. Later that day, Grace returned to the library, where the team had gathered for a debriefing. Maria Hayes was the first to speak, her excitement evident. "Colonel Taylor," Maria began, "I had at least 10 officers come up to me after the gathering, asking how they could join the mentorship program. We might need to expand it sooner than we planned." Grace smiled warmly. "That's wonderful to hear, Maria. Let's work on a plan to accommodate them. Growth like this is a challenge, but it's the best kind to have." Clara chimed in next. "The students were so proud to share their projects. I've had teachers from other schools reaching out, asking how they can bring the leadership program to their classrooms. This could really take off." "We'll support that expansion too," Grace said, "step by step. I don't want anyone feeling overwhelmed." Susan Miller leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said, "this movement is becoming bigger than any one initiative. People are starting to see what's possible when they come together. The challenge now is keeping the momentum going." Grace nodded, her gaze steady. "We will. As long as we stay true to our values and listen to the community, this will continue to grow." As the weeks passed, the ripple effects of their efforts became more apparent. The mentorship program, now reaching multiple precincts, fostered connections between officers that strengthened morale and accountability. Maria and Brian worked tirelessly, using their own experiences to guide others and create a culture of support and respect. In the schools, Clara's leadership program became a cornerstone of character education. Students who had once been shy or disengaged were now stepping up as leaders, organizing events, and mentoring their peers. One afternoon, Grace visited a middle school to observe a leadership workshop. As she watched a group of students collaborate on a project, she felt a deep sense of pride. Their enthusiasm and creativity were infectious, a testament to the seeds Clara had planted. After the session, a young girl approached Grace, clutching a small notebook. "Colonel Taylor, I just wanted to say thank you," the girl said shyly. "This program has helped me feel more confident. I even want to be a leader when I grow up." Grace knelt to meet the girl's gaze, her voice soft but steady. "You already are a leader," she said, "and I can't wait to see all the amazing things you'll do." Meanwhile, Grace's partnership with Mayor Evelyn Brooks continued to flourish. Together, they launched a citywide initiative aimed at fostering civic engagement and leadership training across diverse sectors. The initiative included workshops, public forums, and volunteer opportunities designed to empower residents and strengthen the community. At a press conference announcing the initiative, Mayor Brooks acknowledged Grace's pivotal role. "Colonel Taylor has shown us that change begins with a single step. Her vision and leadership have brought us here today, and I am honored to stand alongside her as we take this next step together." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Grace felt more humbled than celebrated. To her, the real victory lay in the collective effort of everyone involved. Amid the progress, Grace remained attuned to the challenges that persisted. Not everyone embraced the changes, and there were still moments of resistance and skepticism. Grace approached these obstacles with patience, knowing that meaningful transformation took time. One evening, she received an email from Brian Carter. It was brief but heartfelt, expressing gratitude for her support and sharing a recent success story from the mentorship program. "Colonel Taylor, I wanted to thank you again for believing in the possibility of change. The program has helped me grow in ways I never imagined, and now I'm seeing that growth in others too. I still have a lot to learn, but I'm committed to the journey. Thank you for setting me on this path." Grace smiled as she read the email, her heart swelling with pride. Brian's transformation was a powerful reminder that no one was beyond redemption, and that even the smallest steps could lead to profound change. As the seasons shifted toward winter, Grace found herself reflecting on the journey so far. She thought about the initial supermarket confrontation that had sparked everything the moment she had chosen to speak up, not knowing where it would lead. Her life had changed in ways she never could have anticipated. What had begun as a single act of accountability had grown into a movement of unity, resilience, and hope. One crisp evening, as snowflakes began to drift lazily through the air, Grace stood outside the library, gazing at the mural painted by students and community members. The vibrant hands joined in a circle seemed to glow in the soft light of the street lamp. Maria and Clara joined her, their breath visible in the cold air. "You've built something incredible here, Grace," Maria said quietly. Grace turned to them, her voice steady and warm. "We've built it together, and we're not done yet." That night, Grace wrote in her journal, "The ripples we create extend further than we can see. Every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every step toward accountability builds a foundation for the future. And as long as we keep moving forward together, there's no limit to what we can achieve." With those words, she closed the journal and gazed out at the snowy street. The journey was far from over, but Grace knew they were on the right path. Together, they were building a legacy of hope, one step at a time. Winter deepened in Charlotte, painting the town with soft blankets of snow and casting a calm over the bustling streets. For Grace Taylor, the season brought not only a quiet beauty, but also a time for reflection. The ripple effects of the movement she had helped ignite were everywhere: mentorship programs thriving, leadership workshops expanding, and community bonds strengthening. Yet, as the work progressed, she felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on her shoulders. One morning, Grace sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee, while reviewing notes from a recent meeting with Mayor Evelyn Brooks. The citywide civic engagement initiative was gaining traction, but logistical challenges loomed. Resources were stretched thin, and tensions occasionally surfaced among stakeholders with differing visions. Oliver, her ever-loyal cat, jumped onto the table, nudging her hand with his head. Grace smiled, scratching behind his ears. "You're right, Oliver. I need to step back and take a breath." She set her pen down and allowed herself a rare moment of stillness, gazing out the window at the snow-covered street. That afternoon, Grace attended a mentorship session at a local precinct. Maria Hayes and Brian Carter had invited her to observe the program's progress, and she was eager to see how it had evolved. The room buzzed with energy as officers shared their experiences and discussed scenarios designed to foster accountability and empathy. Maria facilitated the session with confidence, while Brian's contributions reflected his own growth. During a break, Maria approached Grace. "How do you think we're doing?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of pride and uncertainty. Grace placed a reassuring hand on Maria's shoulder. "You're doing incredible work. The discussions here are meaningful and honest. That's exactly what this program needs." Maria smiled, her confidence bolstered. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear that." As the session resumed, Brian shared a story about a recent encounter with a young man who had been apprehensive about speaking with an officer. "I could tell he didn't trust me," Brian admitted. "So, I took a step back and just listened. I let him share his concerns without interrupting or trying to defend myself. By the end of the conversation, he told me he appreciated that I treated him with respect." The room was quiet as Brian continued. "I used to think being an officer meant always having control, always being the authority. But now I see that sometimes it's about giving people space to be heard." Grace felt a swell of pride as she listened. Brian's transformation was a testament to the power of humility and growth. Meanwhile, Clara's student leadership initiative was gaining recognition. Grace attended a showcase at one of the participating schools, where students presented projects ranging from community service campaigns to innovative solutions for local challenges. One group of students had created a program to collect unused winter clothing and distribute it to families in need. Their presentation was heartfelt and organized, and the impact of their efforts was evident in the gratitude of the families they had helped. After the showcase, Grace approached the group's leader, a confident young girl named Sophia. "You've done something truly remarkable here," Grace said. "You've made a real difference in people's lives." Sophia beamed. "We couldn't have done it without the leadership program. It taught us how to work together and take action." Grace's heart swelled with pride. "Keep leading, Sophia. The world needs people like you." Amid the progress, Grace remained mindful of the challenges that persisted. Not everyone embraced the changes with open arms. Some resisted, questioning the need for accountability programs or dismissing them as unnecessary. One evening, as Grace prepared for a meeting, she received an email from a resident voicing concerns about the mentorship initiative. The tone was critical, questioning its value and suggesting the funds could be better spent elsewhere. Grace sighed, setting the email aside. The resistance was disheartening, but she knew it was part of the journey. Change often met with skepticism before it was fully understood. The turning point came during a town hall meeting, where Grace was invited to speak about the impact of the programs. The room was packed with residents, some supportive, others skeptical. Grace approached the podium, her calm demeanor masking the nerves she felt. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight. The programs we've implemented over the past few months are more than initiatives. They're opportunities for growth, connection, and healing. I understand that not everyone sees the value in these efforts, and that's okay. Skepticism is part of the process. But I'd like to share what I've seen: the officers who've found new purpose through mentorship, the students who've discovered their leadership potential, the residents who've felt heard and respected for the first time in years. These are not abstract concepts. They're real people whose lives have been touched by the work we've done together. And I believe that's worth investing in. As she stepped back from the podium, the room erupted in applause. Among the faces in the crowd, Grace saw Maria, Clara, and even Brian, their expressions filled with pride and encouragement. That night, Grace reflected on the meeting, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges were daunting, but the progress was undeniable. In her journal, she wrote, "Change is not a straight path. It's a winding road, filled with obstacles and detours. But with perseverance and unity, we can navigate it together and reach a place where everyone feels they belong." As she closed the journal and prepared for bed, Grace felt a quiet resolve. The journey was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever came next with courage, kindness, and an unshakable belief in the power of community. The new year brought with it a sense of renewal and purpose. In Charlotte, the programs and initiatives spearheaded by Grace Taylor and her team continued to flourish. Each week seemed to unveil a new success story: a young leader emerging in the student initiative, an officer in the mentorship program changing their approach to community engagement, or a neighborhood group coming together to tackle local issues. But for Grace, the work was about more than individual victories. It was about creating a foundation that would endure long after she was gone, a legacy of unity, trust, and shared purpose. One chilly January morning, Grace found herself back at the community library. She had been invited to speak at a gathering celebrating the first anniversary of the mentorship program. The space buzzed with energy as officers, students, teachers, and residents mingled, sharing stories and ideas. Maria Hayes and Brian Carter stood near the podium, greeting attendees and answering questions about the program's expansion. Grace couldn't help but smile as she watched them. Their transformation, both personal and professional, was a testament to the power of humility and growth. As the program began, Maria introduced Grace with a heartfelt speech. "Colonel Taylor's vision and leadership have changed this community in ways we could only dream of," she said. "She's taught us that change is possible, that it starts with small actions and grows through perseverance and unity. It's an honor to introduce her today." Grace stepped to the podium, the applause filling the room like a warm embrace. She paused, taking in the faces before her, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady. "It's hard to believe how far we've come in just a year. What started as a simple act of accountability has grown into something far greater, a movement built on trust, respect, and the belief that we are stronger together. But this journey hasn't been easy. Change rarely is. We've faced skepticism, setbacks, and moments of doubt. Yet, we've also seen the incredible power of community, the way people from different walks of life can come together to create something meaningful. The programs we've built are not the work of one person. They are the work of many, each of you contributing your ideas, your time, and your hearts. And together, we've proven that when we invest in each other, we all rise." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Grace felt humbled rather than celebrated. For her, the moment wasn't about personal recognition. It was about honoring the collective effort that had brought them here. In the days following the event, Grace received countless messages of thanks and encouragement. One, in particular, stood out. It was from a young boy named Caleb who had participated in Clara's student leadership program. "Dear Colonel Taylor, I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for our community. Before I joined the program, I didn't think I could be a leader. Now, I feel like I can make a difference. My friends and I are starting a project to help our neighborhood be safer and cleaner. I hope we can make you proud." Grace read the letter twice, tears pricking her eyes. Caleb's words encapsulated everything she had hoped to achieve, not just creating programs, but inspiring the next generation to take the lead. As winter gave way to spring, Grace found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The supermarket incident that had sparked it all felt like a distant memory, yet its impact continued to ripple outward. She thought of the countless lives that had been touched, from the students who had found their voices to the officers who had rediscovered their purpose. She thought of Maria, Clara, and Brian, whose courage and dedication had carried the movement forward. Most of all, she thought of the future, the potential for continued growth, the challenges that lay ahead, and the hope that burned brightly in her heart. One sunny afternoon, Grace returned to the park where the community mural had been painted. The vibrant hands forming a circle seemed to glow in the light, a symbol of everything they had built together. Maria and Clara joined her, their faces reflecting the same sense of fulfillment Grace felt. "It's beautiful," Clara said, her voice soft. "It's more than beautiful," Maria added. "It's a reminder of what we can achieve when we work together." Grace nodded, her gaze steady. "It's also a promise to keep going, to keep building, and to never lose sight of why we started." The three women stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared journey filling the air. That evening, Grace sat at her desk, her journal open before her. She wrote slowly, carefully, choosing her words. Legacy isn't about one moment or one person. It's about the connections we create, the lives we touch, and the values we pass on. Together, we've built something extraordinary, a community united by kindness, resilience, and hope. And as long as we continue to stand together, there's no limit to what we can achieve. She set her pen down and closed the journal, a quiet smile on her face. The journey wasn't over, far from it, but Grace felt a profound sense of peace, knowing they were on the right path. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the town she had come to love so deeply. And as the night settled in, Grace Taylor looked ahead with unwavering determination, ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would continue to build a legacy of unity, one step at a time. As Grace Taylor's journey reminds us, even the smallest acts of courage and accountability can ignite change, building bridges of trust and unity within our communities. Her story is a testament to resilience, leadership, and the power of coming together to create a brighter future. If this story inspired you, please subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt and empowering tales. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Together, let's celebrate the strength of the human spirit and the change we can create when we stand united. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.